you. Wow. Crazy, huh? Good. How are you?
Good morning. Last night I met with some of the survivors and the loved ones of the victims of the horrific mass shooting at Robb Elementary School. I came here to tell them that the United States Department of Justice has finished its critical incident review. In undertaking this review at the request of the then mayor, the Justice Department committed to using our expertise and independence to assess the law enforcement response to the shooting and to provide guidance moving forward. As I told families and survivors last night, the department's review concluded that a series of major failures in leadership, in tactics, in communications, in training, and in preparedness were made by law enforcement leaders and others responding to the mass shooting at Robb Elementary. As a result, 33 students and 3 of their teachers, many of whom had been shot, were trapped in a room with an active shooter for over an hour as law enforcement officials remained outside. I also told the families and survivors how deeply sorry I am for the losses they suffered that day and for the losses they have suffered every day since. I told them that the priority for the Justice Department in preparing this report has been to honor the memories of those who were taken from them. And I told the families gathered last night what I hope is clear among the hundreds of pages and thousands of details in this report. Their loved ones deserve better. The law enforcement response at Robb Elementary School on May 24th, 2022, and in the hours and days after, was a failure that should not have happened. We hope to honor the victims and the survivors by working together to try to prevent anything like this from ever happening again, here or anywhere. I'm now going to turn to the key observations and recommendations of the report. On May 24th, 2022 at 11:33 a.m., an active shooter wearing body armor and equipped with a high-power AR-15 rifle entered Robb Elementary School and began shooting into classrooms 111 and 112, which shared a connecting door. Within minutes, 11 law enforcement officers from the Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District and the Uvalde Police Department arrived inside the school. Hearing continued gunfire, 5 officers immediately advanced toward classrooms 111 and 112. Within seconds, shots were fired from inside the classroom. Shrapnel hit 2 officers, and all responders retreated to cover. A single officer then made additional attempts to approach the classrooms, but after 11:40 a.m., no more attempts to enter the rooms were made until 12:48 p.m., more than an hour later. As a consequence of failed leadership, training, and policies, injured and scared students and teachers remained trapped with the subject in the classrooms, waiting to be rescued. Survivors later shared that they heard officers gathered outside the classrooms while they waited. The victims trapped in classroom 111 and 112 were waiting to be rescued at 11:44 a.m., approximately 10 minutes after officers first arrived, when the subject fired another shot inside the classrooms. They were still waiting at 11:56 a.m. when an officer on the scene told law enforcement leaders that his wife, a teacher, was inside room 111 and 112 and had been shot. They were still waiting as broadcasts went out on officer radios that a student trapped inside rooms 111 and had called 911 at 12:10 p.m. to say that that the student was in a room full of victims. That student stayed on the phone with 911 for 16 minutes. The victims were still waiting to be rescued when were still waiting for another 27 minutes after that, until finally officers entered the classroom and killed the subject. As the victims were trapped and waiting for help, many of their families were waiting outside the school, growing increasingly concerned about why law enforcement had not taken action to rescue their loved ones. Law enforcement officers from different agencies who had self-deployed to the scene in overwhelming numbers were themselves waiting for leadership decisions about how to proceed. Many officers reported that they did not know who, if anyone, was in charge, what they should do, or the status of the incident. Some officers were confused about why there was no attempt to confront the active shooter and rescue the children. Some officers believed the subject had already been killed, or that law enforcement was in the room with the shooter. 75 minutes after the first officers arrived on scene, officers finally entered room 111. The subject engaged the entry team with gunfire, and the officers responded with fire. 77 minutes after the first officers arrived on the scene, and after 45 rounds had been fired by the active shooter, the shooter was killed. The massacre at Robb Elementary shattered families throughout this community and devastated our country. 19 children and 2 teachers were killed, and untold numbers of students, teachers, and law enforcement officers were injured. The law enforcement response to the mass shooting at Robb Elementary was a failure. As the threat posed to our country by mass shootings has grown and evolved over the past several decades, law enforcement's response tactics have also changed. The massacre at Columbine High School 25 years ago, and the 47 minutes it took for law enforcement to enter that high school, marked a major shift in how law enforcement leaders think about responding to mass shootings. It is now widely understood by law enforcement agencies across the country that in active shooter incidents, time is not on the side of law enforcement. Every second counts. And the priority of law enforcement must be to immediately enter the room and stop the shooter with whatever weapons and tools officers have with them. That is the approach responding officers first employed when they arrived at Robb Elementary School. But within minutes of arriving inside the school, officials on scene transitioned from treating the scene as an active shooter situation to treating the shooter as a barricaded subject. This was the most significant failure. That failure meant that law enforcement officials prioritized the protracted evacuation of students and teachers in other classrooms instead of immediately rescuing the victims trapped with the active shooter. It meant that officials spent time trying to negotiate with the subject instead of entering the room and confronting him. It meant that officials asked for and waited for additional responders and equipment instead of following generally accepted active shooter practice and moving toward the shooter with the resources they had. It meant waiting for a set of keys to open the classroom door, which the report concludes was likely unlocked anyway. And it meant that the victims remained trapped with the shooter for more than an hour after the first officers arrived on scene. There were also other failures in leadership, command, and coordination. None of the law enforcement leaders at the scene established an incident command structure to provide timely direction, control, and coordination among the enormous number of responders who arrived on scene. This lack of a command structure, exacerbated by communication difficulties, contributed to confusion among responders about who was in charge and how they could help. These failures may also have been influenced by policy and training deficiencies at responding law enforcement agencies. Some lacked any active shooter training at all. Some had inappropriate training. Some lacked critical incident response training, and the vast majority had never trained together with different agencies. As Associate Attorney General Benita Gupta will discuss in further detail, the chaos and confusion that defined the law enforcement response while the shooter remained a threat also defined the aftermath of the shooting. For example, surviving victims, some with bullet wounds and other injuries, were put on buses without being brought to the attention of medics. Some families were told that their family members had survived when they had not. And victims, families, and community members struggled to receive timely and accurate information about what had occurred at Robb Elementary. The Justice Department's objective in preparing this report was threefold. First, to honor the victims, the survivors, and their loved ones. Second, to provide a clear and independent accounting of the law enforcement response to the horrific attack that devastated this community. And third, to provide law enforcement agencies and communities across the country with analysis and recommendations about how what happened at Uvalde should inform efforts to prepare themselves for and respond to mass shootings. Policing is a noble profession. It is also a hard one. It requires training and constant education about evolving threats. The report includes widely accepted recommendations that have been adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country about how to prepare for and respond to active shooter situations. Before an active shooter incident occurs, law enforcement agencies have a responsibility to ensure that their leaders and all their officers are trained to focus on rapid response, trained that the first officers on the scene must focus on eliminating the threat and protecting the victims most in danger. Law enforcement officers responding to an active shooter must be prepared to take charge, to establish a unified command, and to facilitate communications, operational coordination, and allocation and delivery of resources. They must continually assess and adjust as the incident evolves. And in the aftermath of a mass shooting, law enforcement and government agencies must provide the public with a sense of trust and confidence by communicating openly, clearly, and compassionately during a time in which many are learning the most devastating news that any human being can receive. The victims and survivors of the mass shooting at Robb Elementary on May 24th, 2022 deserve better. First and foremost, the 19 children and their 2 teachers who were stolen from their loved ones should be here today. They never should have been targeted by a mass shooter. We must never forget the shooter's heinous act that day. And the victims and survivors should never have been trapped with that shooter for more than an hour as they waited for their rescue. The families of the victims and survivors deserve more than incomplete, inaccurate, and conflicting communications about the status of their loved ones. This community deserved more than misinformation from officials during and after the attack. Responding officers here in Uvalde, who also lost loved ones and who still bear the emotional scars of that day, deserve the kind of leadership and training that would have prepared them to do the work that was required. Our children deserve better than to grow up in a country where an 18-year-old has easy access to a weapon that belongs on the battlefield, not in a classroom. And communities across the country and the law enforcement officers who protect them deserve better than to be forced to respond to one horrific mass shooting after another. But that is the terrible reality that we face. And so it is a reality that every law enforcement agency in every community across the country must be prepared for. No community and no law enforcement agency should have to face that threat alone. That is why we came to Uvalde, and that is why we are releasing this report. The Justice Department remains committed to working in partnership with communities across the country and with the law enforcement agencies working to protect those communities every day. In particular, we stand ready to help communities and agencies prepare to respond to a terrible incident like the one that occurred here. We have concluded the department's review, but we know that the work of healing here in Uvalde is only beginning. We are humbled and grateful to stand with this community as you remember and honor your loved ones. I will now turn the podium over to Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta. Her leadership has been key to the department's efforts to conduct an independent, fair, and comprehensive review of the horrific mass shooting of May 24th and its aftermath. I am also grateful to the entire Critical Incident Review Team and to the department's COPS office under the leadership of Hugh Clements for their tireless work. Vanita.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. It is hard to look at the truth that the law enforcement response on May 24th was an unimaginable failure and that a lack of action by adults failed to protect children and their teachers. But we cannot look away from what happened here. We cannot look away from these children, and we cannot look away from what happened in Uvalde. On May 24th, 2022, this community lost 19 beloved children and 2 cherished teachers at Robb Elementary School. In the days and weeks following, this community also lost a sense of faith and trust in their own neighbors and institutions as they tried to make sense of what happened on the 24th and were unable to get the answers they needed. During that time, the then mayor of Uvalde called me to ask the Justice Department to conduct an independent review of what had happened and what went wrong on May 24th and in the days that followed. Shortly after, the Justice Department began its review. The Attorney General just gave a sense of the detailed timeline that we have laid out and the cascading failures that occurred over the course of 77 minutes between when law enforcement arrived on the scene and when they finally entered the classroom. But we also know the pain and the failures and missteps did not end when law enforcement finally entered the classrooms and rescued the survivors. It continued at minute 78, when it became clear that because there was no leader, there was no plan to triage the 35 victims in classrooms 111 and 112, many of whom had been shot. Victims were moved away without precautions. Without appropriate precautions, victims who had already passed away were taken to the hospital in ambulances, while children with bullet wounds were put on school buses without any medical attention. In the commotion, one adult victim was placed on a walkway, on the ground, outside to be attended to. She died there. The reunification and notification process for families was similarly chaotic, and as some of the families described, truly deeply painful. During and after the 77 minutes, families and survivors received unclear and sometimes conflicting information about where to go to reunite with their loved ones. Many family members waited at the school for hours without status updates, not knowing where their children were, if they were safe or hurt, or even alive. Families searching desperately for their loved ones were sent to different places all across town: the high school, the civic center, the hospital. Some of these details are gut-wrenching. Families hearing about the need for autopsy results as the first indications that their loved ones may not have survived. At one point, hours after the shooting, an official incorrectly told families waiting for their children at the Civic Center that an additional bus of survivors was coming. It did not. Inaccurate and inconsistent public communications, including social media posts and press conferences, only made things worse. At 12:06 p.m., law enforcement posted on Facebook, reassuring parents that, quote, students and staff are safe in the buildings, close quote. That false reassurance was never corrected. An hour later, law enforcement inaccurately posted on social media that the shooter was in custody. That post, too, was never corrected. Both impromptu and scheduled news conferences and media engagements contained inaccurate, incomplete, and at times conflicting information. Mirroring the failures of the law enforcement response, state and local agencies failed to coordinate, leading to inaccurate and incomplete information being provided to anxious family and community members and the public. We also know the pain following a tragedy like this endures, and that the support this community needs has often been missing. And we cannot talk about what happened at Robb Elementary School without reckoning with the fact that this tragedy took place somewhere all children should feel supported and cared for and safe. Our report documents missteps in school safety preparation that contributed to this tragedy, including that the campus safety plan was effectively a template and included security measures that were not even available at Robb. That there was a culture of complacency around locked door policies, with interior and exterior doors routinely left unlocked, and that confusion over where to find a master key to unlock classroom doors contributed to the significant delay in entering classrooms 111 and 112. As I made clear last April when I came to Uvalde to meet with families, and as we reiterated to families last night, this report not only looked backwards, but also identifies lessons learned and recommendations for other communities to prevent something like this from happening again. No law enforcement agency or community can assume that what happened here, or in Newtown, or in Parkland, or in Columbine can't happen in their community. That is our reality. This report offers 273 recommendations for law enforcement agencies and other officials in every community. That includes a series of recommendations for law enforcement and government agencies preparing for and responding to mass shooting incidents and active shooter incidents as they occur. In the immediate aftermath of an active shooter incident, law enforcement leaders must continue to provide guidance and direction to all first responders, including triage planning to ensure that emergency personnel can access victims as soon as possible. Law enforcement and government officials must provide proactive, timely, and accurate information, notifications, and give community members as much information as appropriate at any given time to help avoid or mitigate rumors, uncertainty, and unnecessary worry. If an organization shares incorrect information with the public, it should be open about it and correct that mistake. In the days, weeks, and years after a devastating attack, survivors, the family members of victims, community members, law enforcement, and other first responders, and their families should continue to be offered both immediate and ongoing trauma support. The Justice Department remains committed to the Uvalde community. Federal Victims of Crime Act formula funds are being used to support victim services in Uvalde, and our Office for Victims of Crime is working with the state of Texas and the Uvalde community to complete the application for supplemental Justice Department funding that is going to enable continuing services for victims, survivors, and their families. And through our COPS office, the department has also awarded the local school district substantial funding over the past 2 years through our school violence prevention program to help this community continue to improve school safety and security. Before we started this review, we consulted with the International Association of Chiefs of Police to build out a team of experts, including several law enforcement leaders who have ably led their communities through mass violence events. I am grateful to those leaders who lent their expertise to us and to our COPS office team for their immense dedication and commitment. Together, the review team's work included reviewing more than 14,000 pieces of data and documentation, including policies and procedures, training logs, body camera and closed-circuit television footage, photographs, and more. They made 9 visits to Uvalde for a total of 54 days in this community. They conducted more than 260 interviews of individuals from more than 30 organizations and agencies, including responding law enforcement and survivors, family members, victim services providers, and school and hospital staff. They traveled throughout the country to review generally accepted practices and contemporary active shooter training courses. Other organizations and news outlets have documented parts of what happened on this horrific day. But all of this work has led to a Justice Department report that is both the most detailed and broadest in scope, looking beyond the immediate incident to include the communications, victim services, and school safety aspects of this tragedy, as well as the post-incident response and investigation and pre-incident planning and preparation. The public demands a lot from law enforcement, and we often take their service for granted. Every day, police officers run towards danger to keep people safe. In Uvalde on May 24th, 2022, that did not happen until far too late. Uvalde is a community that is healing, and getting clear on the facts is part of healing. So too are the beautiful, powerful murals all over the city, commemorating each child and teacher killed on May 24th. And so too is enacting change in policies and practices to help make sure these failures do not happen again. While it took time for the Justice Department to examine the facts and put this report together, our commitment to the Uvalde community does not end here. Through available funding, resources, victim services, technical assistance, and training, we will support Uvalde and communities across the country in their efforts to prevent and address violence. Just as we have looked back, we will look forward. We are committed to honoring the memories of the lives that were lost here by working to build a future where all of our children, their loved ones, and their teachers can feel cared for, supported, and protected. I will now pass this to Hugh Clements, the director of our COPS office.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Attorney General and Associate Gupta. I know that nothing can take away the pain suffered by the families, the survivors, and the entire Uvalde community. But I do know that the team at the COPS office has been driven to provide an authoritative accounting of everything that transpired at Robb Elementary on May 24th, as well as the events leading up to it and an examination of what happened afterward. As someone with 38 years of law enforcement experience, and 12 of those as chief of the Providence Police Department, I know the importance of having the right policies in place, the right training, and the right partnerships, especially law enforcement partnerships with schools, communities, and other agencies and first responders. This report stresses the importance of those working relationships and how invaluable they are, especially when there's a critical incident. Of course, no one ever thinks something like this is going to happen in their community until it does, which is why the recommendations we provide in this report are so critically important. Unfortunately, the review of the mass shooting at Robb Elementary School is not the first critical incident review that the COPS office has conducted. But having done this before, we know the value of the information provided. Other critical incidents reviews that the COPS office has authored in the past include the reports on the terrorist shooting in San Bernardino, California, and the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. We heard from the agencies involved how valuable these reports were, and we know from talking to agencies across the country how they have incorporated the recommendations shared into their own planning. We have seen how vitally important preparation is, how important it is to have the right policies and procedures in place, how incredibly important training is and how critical it is that agencies train together. Reviews such as this can be tremendously helpful and important to both law enforcement agencies and the communities they serve, as they work together to see how they can improve policies, procedures, systems, and most importantly, relationships. We talk about that and much, much more in this report, which I know is going to be a very important resource to law enforcement agencies in the months and the years to come. You will see in this report that the team has worked diligently in carrying out a number of critical steps, including developing a complete incident reconstruction, reviewing thousands of relevant documents, conducting site visits, and interviewing a wide variety of stakeholders. As I said, we know that nothing can take away the pain that this community has endured. But we were dedicated to providing this community with a transparent, independent, and thorough review of what happened. And I believe that this report has done just that. Thank you.
Great, raise your hand if you have a question. Right here. All right, Delaney, and then Lucy.
Thanks. Mr. Attorney General, you just described how the document found failures by law enforcement. But the report also makes a point of withholding the names of all of the most senior law enforcement officials. Does this report sufficiently hold accountable individuals responsible for failures?
So the report is an analysis of what happened at Uvalde, including by everyone at Uvalde, all responding agencies. It concludes that this was a failure of leadership, and so all members of the leadership who failed were identified. It also identifies individual officers by rank and by what agency they're from, but the standard practice of the Justice Department in these critical incident reviews is not to name those who are not listed as at fault, and particularly not to name those in lower ranks who acted on the scene.
Next question,
Mr. Attorney
Lee,
General.
case at 12.
I have two questions for you, Mr. Attorney General. Your report here names Pete Arredondo and Mario Vargas as leaders in this incident that happened at Robb Elementary. Had they acted in a way that was put out as guidelines after Columbine shooting, would lives have been saved on May 24th?
I think the report concludes that had the law enforcement agencies followed generally accepted practices in an active shooter situation and gone right after the shooter to stop him, lives would have been saved and people would have survived.
My second question for you, sir, based on this report, we know at this point no criminal charges have been filed against anyone who responded that day. Based on what you all found in this report, should the Uvalde County District Attorney file any criminal charges for the law enforcement officers who responded that day?
Well, I'm going to leave that question for the DA. Just to explain for everyone, the Justice Department only has criminal jurisdiction where federal crime has occurred. The shooter here is dead, and there's no federal criminal jurisdiction. What we've done is responded to the mayor's request that mayor's request for a critical incident response examination to determine the manner in which the agencies responded and to provide recommendations for the future, and that's what we've done.
Next question, Tribune. Texas Tribune.
Mr. Attorney General, you identified one of the objectives of this analysis to provide law enforcement agencies with recommendations. There are nearly 300.
Could you talk a little louder?
Which recommendations do you think law enforcement agencies should undertake immediately? What's the most urgent issue?
Yeah, so the most significant failure and therefore the most significant and urgent thing for law enforcement to do is active shooter training, which provides that when an active shooter is in a building or anywhere else, the first priority is to stop that shooter and to remove people who are immediately endangered by that shooter. And that requires tactical training. That's the first thing. Say the second thing is critical incident response. Establishing who's going to be the on-site commander, making clear to all other agencies that that person will be the on-site commander. That again requires training and practice and response.
Last, go ahead. One more and then one.
Should joint training be mandated across the country?
I'm not sure what the word mandated here means. I think it's absolutely necessary that in any circumstance where there's going to be more than one agency responding, and that's going to be in any school situation, all the possible agencies should train together in order to establish lines of communication, command structure, and communications structure in particular. Here radios were not interactive. People did not have a way to talk to each other, and make sure that everybody's following the same strategy.
Last question, Uvalde Leader News.
Attorney General, some have suggested that our police response was typical for a mass shooting, in fact, even better in many cases. And they used the Pulse nightclub event as a comparison. It took 3 hours to go in and put down that killer, and there were phone calls back and forth. How do you speak to that?
So actually, I'll let Hugh talk about specifically about the Pulse nightclub, but I will say that what I've described and what the report describes is clearly the generally accepted response to an active shooter. We did a survey across the country, and the experts who were involved in this examination are experts in exactly this subject of active shooter, and there's no doubt that the standard practice is the one I've described. And I'm going to let Hugh answer that specific question.
I would say honestly, I don't know if that's entirely true. I will tell you this report is comprehensive, it's extensive. I urge you all to read it, the executive summary, all hundreds of pages. I will say there was a epic, complete lack of leadership, unity of command. There was no incident command set up. That's not the case with the Pulse nightclub. And so in this particular one, in comparison, that is not entirely true, and the response was a failure of leadership.
Great, thank you, everyone.
Mayor Garland, there are a lot of
Thank
family
you,
members.
everyone.
Well, there are a lot of family members here. You just let us know, do you believe charges should be filed?
Does Al know that in the truck?
Are they right here? They're in the, yes, they're right here.
Same stuff that we want, hopefully that will be in black and white.
DOJ's approval or sealed that they will to be able to get off our ass and do something. Thanks.
Hey, how's it going? Yes, once in a while. No, I'm sorry, I'm at work, and then.
Photographer, actually, let's go outside. Let's take you guys a minute. So everything's fine right now.
And so Aaron and I, we've been asked by 17 families, 16 of whom have lost children, to investigate and evaluate potential legal action. And in a moment, we'll turn to the families and they'll tell you what their response is to what they've learned and what they're still learning. Understand that the report has not been made available but for about an hour or two, and it is voluminous, as you've heard. So most of our reaction is really based on what we heard from the Attorney General and his team last night. And so I want to talk about three things. The first thing I want to say is that the families appreciate the Attorney General's commitment to seeing this investigation through. For families in this situation, transparency and comfort and knowing that your government or your state is listening to you and are concerned about what you and your families went through is critically important. They haven't gotten a lot of that from the state of Texas. So for them, that is very much appreciated. And it was clear not just that the DOJ has taken this investigation very seriously,
but that the Attorney General himself, I think you saw it, has expressed great empathy, and that's also very appreciated by the families. There are limitations, though. These families didn't need a 400 or 500-page government report to learn that law enforcement failed them in a historic way. They didn't need the report to tell them that law enforcement violated its most sacred responsibility, and that is to protect our children in a time of great need. They didn't need that. Why didn't they need that? Because they were there. Some had AR-15s pointed at them as they desperately tried to help when law enforcement wouldn't. They were there as their children were being killed while law enforcement was paralyzed. Paralyzed. They were there. So they did not need to learn that. But the details of the investigation will come out for whatever value they provide. It's important to understand go back and let's just refresh our recollection about what happened that day. Within minutes, really, hundreds of heavily armed law enforcement officers were there from all different agencies. The DEA was there. The Border Patrol was there. The Uvalde police were there. The school police were there. The county police were there. Texas Marshals were there. It was a convergence of heavily armed and mostly very well-trained law enforcement agents. And you would think that they were fighting to protect a major army from invading us on our borders, as we would like our law enforcement to protect us. But who was on the other side of this epic battle? What were they afraid of? Were they afraid of an 18-year-old kid? This 18-year-old, let's remember, was about 5'5" or 5'6". He was 140 pounds, soaking wet. Were they really afraid of this kid? No. They were afraid of his weapon. And it turns out that even some of these well-trained officers are human beings. And guess what? We've learned from this event, from Parkland and other events where law enforcement got cold feet. These people were scared. They were scared because they're human beings, and they were scared of getting killed. And they waited around while somebody else was going to be brave enough to intervene. The questions that are not answered in this report are significantly more important than the questions that are. This 18-year-old kid was able to walk into a store down the street and acquire a military weapon, a Daniel Defense AR-15. And within about a week, he acquired another one. The day he turned 18, he had made his decision long in advance. In fact, he had ordered 60 30-round magazines, and they were delivered to his home. How did that happen? Where's the government investigation on how this kid got this firepower? The other thing that happened is he ordered over 1,700 rounds of ammunition from an online ammo dealer. How could that happen? How could that happen? Where's the investigation into that? How did this 18-year-old kid even know enough to know how to equip himself in this way? What happened? What are the means by which gun companies are marketing these weapons to our children? How are they reaching them? Where's the role of marketing and the gun companies in this report? There's no fault or investigation whatsoever. The truth is you can respond to an active shooting, but let's not delude ourselves. You might be able to save a few lives, but we can't accept that that's the best we can do. Over 12 years ago, about 12 years ago, almost 12 years ago, after the Sandy Hook shooting, shattered families went to the United States Senate and they begged, they pleaded, they said to our elected officials, it's too late for us. Our children were just killed by a kid, a troubled kid under 21 who used an AR-15 to kill our children. They said, help us. You can't help us, but you can help us by helping others. You can help us by help. And Congress turned their back on the Sandy Hook families. And Congress turned their back on the Sandy Hook families. And because of that, and by the way, the Sandy Hook families weren't the only families to plead, to beg, to say, let's protect our children. There were other families. Every mass shooting that occurs, almost, there are families pleading with the government to do something. Parkland families said the same thing. They said, okay, how about now? How about now? Let's limit the access to these weapons to children, to kids 18, 19, 20 years old. And Congress thumbed their nose at the Parkland families. And the Attorney General's here. He's done nobody can fault the Attorney General for his commitment to this or his concern for these families. It's very moving. And his entire office, and I applaud them in this effort. But the Attorney General wouldn't be here. None of his team would be here. I wouldn't be standing here. Most importantly, these wonderful families wouldn't be here, standing here pleading, talking about what happened that day. You wouldn't be here. But if Congress had just listened, instead of just listened to the Sandy Hook families, if they had just listened to Parkland, you know who would be here? Eva Morelos, Irma Garcia, Zaya Garcia, Xavier Lopez, Amory Jo Garza, Jose Flores Jr., Alitha Ramirez, Annabel Guadalupe Rodriguez, Eliana Torres, Eliana Garcia, Rogelio Torres, Jacqueline Casares, Jayla Silvera, Jace Nuevanos, Lexi Rubio, Tess Mata, McKenna Elrod, Neve Bravo, Layla Salazar, Maite Rodriguez, and Miranda Mathis. Think about that. This shooting doesn't happen if our government had just listened to these families, or and not just our government, but if the state of Texas had just even done the paltry thing of making it, even raising the age to 21, they would all be alive. And isn't that such a small price to pay? Yeah. We're going to turn it over now. Sorry? Yeah. We're going to turn it over now to our wonderful families who would like to speak and express themselves. And I'll introduce Kimberly Rubio.
Folks, a few families will speak, and then we'll do questions at the end. Okay.
Reading this report this morning, I read that Pete directed officers intending to gain entry into the classroom to stop. That no leader effectively questioned the decision and lack of urgency of UCISD PD Chief Arredondo and UPD Acting Chief Mariano Vargas toward entering classrooms 111 and 112, and that leadership can arise regardless of rank and title. I hope that the failures end today and that local officials do what wasn't done that day, do right by the victims and survivors of Robb Elementary, terminations, criminal prosecutions. And our state and federal government enact sensible gun laws, because Robb Elementary began the day an 18-year-old wasn't allowed to purchase an AR-15.
Most importantly, from what we've seen with this report, and I commend the DOJ on doing this, is that although there isn't every name of the officers that were there so that we can hold them accountable, because we have to do our own digging most of the time, there are names that are named. And it is time, because our community is so divided because of this, because they don't want to believe that the people that they grew up with failed our children and they stand against us. I'm hoping that they read this and they see Johnny Phil's name, or Mariano Pargas's, who is a county commissioner right now, or Constable Zamora, who is running for re-election. There are names in there, and the community needs to see this, and y'all need, because the DOJ stamp is on there, maybe y'all will start taking us seriously now, instead of telling us to move on, telling us to sweep it under the rug, and not doing a damn thing about it. We need our community. It's hard enough waking up every day and continuing to walk out on these streets and walk to an HEB or drive to an HEB and see a cop that you know was standing there while our babies were murdered and bleeding out. It's hard enough that. If this community doesn't care, and I hope this makes y'all. I also hope that this lights a fire up under the district attorney's ass, because we know that she has not done a damn thing, and we refuse to accept that. Do your job.
Does anyone else want to talk before we take questions? Let's try to go one at a time and just introduce yourselves so they know who they're talking to. Where do we want to start? Shimon,
Hi, yeah. So just
just let them know who you are, Shimon.
Shimon Prokopiev, CNN. Just do you guys feel that the report went far enough in naming people and holding people accountability? Because as we know, the DPS had the largest number of law enforcement officials outside of the CBP, and there's a lot of video and a lot of information about their actions that day. But it doesn't seem that this report really touches on their actions. It seems to focus mostly on the local officers, Arredondo and the chiefs. Are you concerned about that? Just maybe some reaction to that.
I don't see
Would you guys mind coming up to the mics?
I don't understand why they are allowed privacy. My child, their children, they are named in this report because they are dead. Everybody should have been named.
Do you feel, Kim, if I could follow up, that somehow maybe DPS is off the hook on this when you look at this report? Or do any of you want to just
I mean, it's kind of hard to answer the question because we've only been given an hour and a half to kind of just look through the report. So we don't even know if they are mentioned in there or not. We would hope that they are because they were there, so we hope that they would be accountable for their actions as well.
Ronnie, following up on that, Monica Madden, KXAN and Nexstar. I know that you said you're still sifting through the report and everything, but were you hoping that the Attorney General would have addressed a lot of more of the aftermath, the delays in the DA's investigation, DPS's investigation into its officers' actions and accountability? Were you hoping that he would address more of that publicly?
I mean, of course we would have. We're grateful that we got what we have right now because it's probably the most updated information that any of us have gotten since May 24th. So, and we're very appreciative of what he's done right now. But yeah, we would have liked to have more information.
The other
BBC Radio, did you learn anything new from what you've seen in this report? Is there anything that you didn't know before?
We knew as families, just kind of talking amongst each other, we knew the failures that had happened. We just kind of, it makes more clarity now because it's written and now it's set in stone, and what we thought is true. So
I did learn something.
you did.
I didn't realize that the scene was compromised.
What?
The scene was compromised, so that there was people that shouldn't have been there that were entering the classroom. That's mentioned in the report.
And how did that make you feel to learn that?
And I want to continue reading more when we're done here.
Let's do a couple more and then we'll go read.
two quick ones. News 4, WAI, KBB in San Antonio. In all of your guys' mind, is there any question left that the DA should have all that she needs, all that she is required to have for her investigation to be able to pursue criminal charges now at this point?
What else does she need?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the most extensive piece that we have about all of the failures that happened that day. What else does she possibly need to prosecute or to remove these people from their positions of power when they can't even do their jobs?
Yami Virgen, KBB, WOAI. How safe are the children of Uvalde right now?
I think the point of this is that none of us are safe. That's what, Josh just mentioned. None of us are safe because these weapons are on the streets.
Let's go right down here, right? Sorry.
Guys, Amanda Anderson from the Sport Fox San Antonio. I've talked to so many of you over the past year. A lot of you recently have expressed concerns about the 2-year mark, meaning that the statute of limitations for misdemeanors will expire. Are you hoping that this will potentially fast track the upcoming DA investigation, the ongoing DA investigation?
Well, the DA, even the DA can't get in our way of fully in our way of an investigation. But it ought to be, to your point, it ought to be said that the DA, with the help of the AG here in Texas, is fighting the disclosure of a lot of this important information. So the DA is effectively, the DA has a job to do. We understand that, but she's locked up this information that these families deserve to have access to evaluate their legal rights. There's no reason why she can't do her job so that we can do ours, and so that these families get the information they deserve to make the decisions they have to make.
Assuming she's still giving you no timeline updates whatsoever?
I mean, I think at this point, it's not a good bet to bet on the DA's timelines.
Over here, Sergio Martinez Beltran with FTR's Texas Newsroom. Quick question, you talk about how you're representing the family, you're trying to conduct an investigation. What's the purpose of it? Is it potentially to sue the local law enforcement agencies? Like, what are you hoping?
Well, it's similar. I mean, of course, the DOJ looks at the criminal, the DA is looking at criminal allegations. But the other facet to these incidents is what went wrong, and how can we hold those people accountable? And the traditional other means that we do so, which is by bringing legal action against them, so that there's another incentive to clean up their act, right? And so so we have to look at all the angles here. What contributed to this? And it should be noted that when many of us were growing up, maybe am I the oldest person here? But when many of us were growing up, we didn't have these routine mass shootings with AR-15s. But guess what? AR-15s were available. So something's changed. And so one of the big things that we've seen in Sandy Hook and Parkland and other cases is that what's changed is the way these weapons are pushed on youth. And this is a tragic and unnecessary example of the repercussions of that. When I was growing up, nobody knew what an AR-15 was, and here every kid of a certain age, especially boys, know what they are because they're being courted, and they're being courted with other actors like social media and et cetera. So these gun companies are really pushing these products on kids for these types of missions.
William Otto from the Texas Tribune, are you suggesting that you're going to pursue charges against gun manufacturers?
Well, I don't bring charges, but fair enough. But the legal issues that were under consideration now I can't really speak about beyond just the big picture type of things that you have to look at in an incident like this. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into something like this.
For the families now, what are the next steps? As we now have one of these investigations out, there's numerous. The DPS is still doing their investigation. We obviously have the DA who is still doing theirs. What is next for all of you as you continue to try and move forward and, one, put the day behind you, but two, create change?
I think we're going to continue fighting. We're going to continue fighting that some type of change is made in honor of our kids. We have nothing left but to fight for them. We are their voices now, so we're going to continue.
Can I just get a reaction from someone, the Attorney General, having him stand there, very significant moment when he says that lives, had officers follow protocol and procedure, the lives could have potentially been saved. How was that? How was that for you to hear him say that?
I mean, how do you want us to react to that?
Because so many people have not wanted to say that here, in the law enforcement officials.
It was pretty hard. I mean, respectful for telling us, but I mean, it was pretty hard, to hear that. When he sits there and says that, lives could have been saved. I mean, I just can't come closer to the like, I just couldn't believe it. For these officers who sit there and just not do anything, and still be out here, you know, on the streets like nothing happened, you know. And my daughter's gone. It was hard. It was hard.
I think we're gonna leave it there, folks, and let the family still read a little bit. Thanks, everybody.
I think we need to
I'm the grandfather of Layla Salazar, and this mass shooting here, why is it that our officers got rewarded instead of being punished? They got raises instead of getting demotion. That's what I don't understand. The DPS major there that's sitting behind Abbott got a $40,000 raise. The Texas Ranger that had been suspended a year ago, fired, he's still getting paid over $100,000. Why are we paying these officers and then you want us to trust them with our families when they're getting paid to do nothing? We lost 19 children and 2 parents and another husband that died right after. So really, I don't see where we should be rewarding our officers. Because I was at the courthouse when they had the commissioner's court, and they asked me if they should have a raise, and I told them straight out, no. They don't deserve a raise. If you cannot serve and protect the people, these were children. All they wanted to do was play. There's no reason this should have happened. They should have did. They ignored the training that was supposed to be since Columbine, and they ignored it. There's too many failures in this situation that happened here in South, and for that.